My Gavanan Melonin, and well met indeed. I'm Adrian Galadirthan, head of the modding team behind Divide and Conquer, but welcome to another lore overview for one of our factions, and indeed a faction in Middle-earth itself, today dealing with Dol Amroth. Now there are no special thanks at the start of this video, but my thanks as ever go out to each and every one of you for just watching along and generally being all right. Do note that this one, because Dol Amroth, I have to say, I'm almost excited to do this one. I love Dol Amroth, and I can't possibly talk about Dol Amroth without giving you a full rendition of the Song of Nimrodel. So in a change to the usual format, there will be a fifth part of today's episode, and if you're interested in listening to the song, that will come at the very end, and you can find the links and the individual timestamps in the description. But let us dive in then with the nation or principality or faction of Dol Amroth. The great castle and promontory of Dol Amroth has a very long yet fairly unreported history. It holds the accolade, along with the city of Pelargir, of being one of the oldest settled regions in all of Gondor, discounting, of course, the middlemen who actually lived there before the Elven and Númenórean colonizations. One small point before we begin: I will refer to Dol Amroth as such throughout this narration, but note that it was not actually called that for many years after it was settled. Tolkien, as with many things, unfortunately ran out of time before he could give the city a name before Amroth's death. The long history of Dol Amroth begins with the elves of Beleriand and their flight from the War of Wrath, a common theme for many factions in fact. After their homeland was sank beneath the sea, the elves spread out from Lindon to seek new lands and found new realms. Many Sindar elves made for the southern lands that would eventually become Gondor, and it was here that they settled down. The elves, being of the Sindar who could not stomach the Noldor and resolved to live apart from them, settled at the mouth of the Morthond River. There was a natural and defensible harbour here that was the home of some primitive fisher folk. The natives fled at the sight of the elves, and the great elven port city of Itheland was founded. Itheland means Elf Haven. With their chief city founded, the elves began a peaceful existence far from the woes of the world, and despite being quite close to Mordor, they were far from the threat of Sauron. After a time, the number of elves in Belfalas swelled greatly with the coming of a number of Sylvan and Nandor elves from Lorinand, the woodland realm that would become Lothlorien. At the head of this large influx of elves were Galadriel and Celeborn. It is said that at this time, the promontory that would become the city of Dol Amroth was finally settled. Galadriel and Celeborn came to Dol Amroth after the War of the Elves and Sauron, and it seems likely, and more than mere consequence, that many elves now sought to flee to the coasts and leave Middle-earth not long after Sauron had reappeared and showed how much power he could muster. It is not known for how long Galadriel and Celeborn stayed in the lands of Belfalas, but by the beginning of the Third Age, some 1,300 years after they had arrived, they had returned to Imladris. The bay between Dol Amroth and Itheland was known as the Cobus Haven, and as mentioned, it was from here that many elves began their journey away west, beginning after the War of the Elves and Sauron. Itheland and Dol Amroth were better placed for Nandor and Sindar elves coming down out of the Greenwood and Lorinand to make the journey west. Mithlond was considerably further away. In the middle to late Second Age, around the time of Galadriel and Celeborn's arrival to Belfalas, the Númenóreans also began to undertake their own colonization. They settled a number of harbours and towns whose names are forgotten, but in the 2350th year of the Second Age, around 600 years after Galadriel and Celeborn had come to the area, the Númenóreans founded the great city of Pelargir. It became in time a bastion for the faithful Númenóreans and was their chief haven on the shores of Middle-earth, a counterpart to the darker sides in Umbar. Shore, as well, is an aptly chosen word for the siting of Pelargir, because at the time of its founding, before the Akhalabeth and the destruction of Númenor, the city was actually on the coast, and not, as it would appear on all maps thereafter, and almost all maps that one can find when searching for Pelargir, a long way inland at the conflux of the Anduin and Cerny rivers. Sometime around the founding of Pelargir, likely shortly afterwards, a number of Númenorian families also came to Belfalas, and there they took up residence with the elves. They did not come to live with the elves at Atheland, and instead they made their home amongst the lesser men of the lands of Dol Amroth. Along with the citizens of Pelargir, the colonists of Belfalas sided with the faithful Númenorians and welcomed Elendil when he fled to the shores of Middle-earth. There, at the end of the Second Age, Elendil officially gave the lands of Belfalas to those colonists who had made it their home, and it is said that Elendil named their lord as Prince. And thus it passed that the lands about Dol Amroth came to be known as Dor Renernil, the lands of the Prince. This is another aspect, though, of the Dol Amroth story that sadly suffers under Tolkien's mortality, for it is written otherwise that the first prince was actually named some 2,000 years later. It is generally taken, though, that the latter mention of a first prince is erroneous, and indeed the peoples of Dol Amroth had been ruled under a prince for all of the Third Age. Before we truly talk of princes, however, we must now first talk of names, with finally the coming of Amroth. Amroth was the Sindar king of all the elves of Lothlorien. His ascension to the kingship was a sorry tale, for his father, Amdir, who had ruled the Forest Realm for some time, in peace, had died in the War of the Last Alliance. And so it was that Amroth became king in the aftermath of that war, and his people had not come through it unscathed. At this time, the elves of Lorien were predominantly Nandor or Sylvan elves, but by the time Amroth became king, the Sindar had been living amongst the lesser elves for nearly 3,000 years. Harmony was very much the order of the day, but for one Sylvan elf, the Sindar remained outsiders, and to escape them, she lived apart from the main host of elves in Lorien. She lived alone by a small forest river that would, in time, bear her name. She was Nimrodel, and despite her fear, distrust, and possible hatred of the Sindar, there was one amongst them who she held dearly, Amroth himself. Amroth and Nimrodel were lovers, deeply taken with one another, but despite this, and all their long, long years together, she refused his offers of marriage. After nearly 2,000 years of his rule, the Balrog awoke in Moria, and spread a new fear out amongst the lands around. Nimrodel was severely struck with this new-come shadow, and she fled Lothlorien to the borders of Fangorn Forest. Filled with concern for her, and knowing that his love for Nimrodel outgrew his love for his homeland, Amroth suggested the two lovers leave Middle-earth and make for the city of Atheland. Together with a small entourage, the elves made for the White Mountains, to cross over and into the lands of Belfalas beyond. In those high peaks, however, their party became separated, and Amroth came to Atheland long before Nimrodel, and alone. There he waited aboard the ship that would carry them away. Long he waited, and still no sign of his love came down out of the mountains. Fate finally intervened, and as is so often the case, it did not cast a benevolent light on Amroth's situation. A mighty storm, rising in the north and blowing across the land of Gondor, swept Amroth's ship out to sea and churned the sea behind to fury. Awakening, Amroth would not leave without Nimrodel, and mightily, as a swan to flight, he dove from the ship to swim back to the shore. And he was never seen again. And so it was that the great promontory became Dol Amroth, or in English, Amroth's Head. As for the Lady Nimrodel, none can say. Whilst it seems almost irrefutable that she met her death in the high mountains, it could and may well be that she wanders there still, ever calling out to her lost love. It is, however, from this sad story that the true story of Dol Amroth finally begins. For one of the elves who accompanied Amroth and Nimrodel across the mountains was a fair maiden named Mithrelas. She, unlike Nimrodel, successfully made the journey to Atheland, and there she met a man, Imrazor. Imrazor was a man of Gondor, but in almost the only known case of this, save perhaps for Imrahil some 2,000 years later, or 1,000 rather, he still held an Ardenaic name, and this is 2,000 years after Númenor sank beneath the sea. Imrasor was the ruler of the peoples of Dol Amroth, and he and Mithrelas fell deeply in love. And from their happy union, the first truly named Prince of Dol Amroth was born, Prince Galador. This was in the 2004th year of the Third Age, around 1,000 years before the events of The Lord of the Rings, and before the birth of Imrahil. In that time, over the coming years, the people of Dol Amroth prospered under a succession of 20 princes. They took the swan as their symbol, owing to the large number of the birds that dwelt in the Cobus Haven, and Dol Amroth also became famous for its harpists, and was renowned throughout Gondor for its proud and true and unbroken Númenorian or half-elven bloodlines. It is, however, worth mentioning that as Dol Amroth grew in fame, strength, and power, Etheland, the founding city of the region, decayed and slipped away from the pages of history. The elves abandoned Etheland once and for all not long after Amroth's death, and the Gondorians did not claim the place as their own in any official capacity. So it is that time brings us forth to the rule of the 21st Prince of Dol Amroth, grandfather to Boromir and Faramir, the proud Adrihil II. Adrihil was born in the year 2917, 100 years before the War of the Ring, and he ruled over the Principality of Dol Amroth for 33 years, from his 60th year to his death at age 93. Adrihil's reign was not marked by any great event in Dol Amroth's history, save for the coming of Aragorn, disguised as he was as Thorongil, Eagle of the Star. Also, as alluded to, Adrihil's daughter, Finduilas, married Denethor of Gondor, and from that union was born Boromir and Faramir. In truth, it is with Imrahil that Dol Amroth is known to many. He was brother-in-law to steward Denethor II, and, for a time, was the steward of all Gondor before the return of its rightful king. In Imrahil's time, the stronghold of Dol Amroth was known for its military prowess, bringing both the most reinforcements to the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, and indeed for bringing perhaps the most famed mounted knights in all of Gondor. With the coming of Sauron's final war, and the threat to all the free peoples greater than ever, the proud and tall sea princes of Dol Amroth are Gondor's greatest hope for success. Under their aged but mighty prince Adrihil II, the armies of the Ship and Swan muster from all the lands of Belfalas. With the hammerstroke falling hardest on Gondor proper, it is for Dol Amroth to hold back the smaller strikes coming up from the deserts of the south. The Arad Anayim, long-lost sons of Númenor, have come anew to Middle-earth and stir the armies of Umbar. With them, fierce tribes of Haradrim and Variags of Khand also make war on Gondor's southern border. Standing together, Dol Amroth and Gondor must hold back the tide, lest all the lands fall to the shadow. Yet hope is not lost. Whilst the masterwork of the Númenorians and the elves may be forgotten in the heartlands of Gondor, the traditions of Elena remain strong in Dol Amroth, and she fields some of the finest human forces in Middle-earth. The Elven and Númenorian bloodlines remain true in many in Dol Amroth, and their people are proud and tall, bearing physical qualities of those mightier races that came before them. Many years before the War of the Ring, a military council was established in Dol Amroth that was tasked with assisting the prince in the defence of the realm. They were known as the Order of the Swan, and their numbers included admirals and grizzled captains of war. They served their function well, but, over time, Dol Amroth found less and less need for a military council, and the Order gradually shifted to become the advisory council of the prince on all matters. Its numbers grew, but the hearts of men are easily corrupted. Men abused their power, and where before admirals and captains debated the survival of Dol Amroth itself, now fat and greedy merchants squabbled in their pursuits for personal wealth. The tendrils of this ever-corrupting order pierced all levels of Amrothian society, and it seemed that to remove them altogether would be near impossible. Despite the rising threat of Sauron and raiders coming to Dol Amroth from the south, the Order proved it could no longer fulfill its purpose in the waning years of the Third Age. Whilst Amrothian men and women bled on the fields of Hrondor in service to their beloved nation, the Order continued to line its members' pockets. Seeing that action must be taken, but cautious of the power of the Order, Prince Angelimir, father of Adrihil, took matters into his own hands. In secret, Angelimir refounded the Order in its original image, filling its ranks with only military advisors and military veterans. And so it was that the Brotherhood of the Talon was born anew from the ashes of the Order of the Swan. Angelimir ensured the Brotherhood answered to him and the Steward only. The men were chosen for their military prowess and not for the purity of their blood, the size of their pockets, or the influence they had with Gondorian nobles. The Brotherhood of the Talon, whilst operating relatively secretly for fear of invoking a reaction from the Order, has proven to be a great success, and has helped to mobilize the army of Dol Amroth into humanity's greatest fighting force. In perhaps their greatest show of defiance to the Order, they began to outfit a battalion of the most elite sons of Dol Amroth, who would answer to the Prince alone. The Talon Knights, and their mounted counterpart the Knights of the Silver Swan, now led the charge in Dol Amroth's hope for survival. The nation-state of Dol Amroth is led in the year 2980 by the wise and powerful Prince Adrihil II. He leads his own personal battalion of Talon Knights on the field, but age has slowly crept up on him, as it does to all things. In truth, Dol Amroth's favourite son, Imrahil, is the greatest war commander, and his mounted battalions can cut down hundreds of the poorly armed and poorly organised desert clansmen. Dol Amroth is proud, but small. Near constant raids coming out of Umbar, coupled with the corrupt and greedy leadership from the members of the Order of the Swan, has decimated the Amrothian economy. And whilst their army is professional and highly trained, it comes at a great price, and the battle for Hrondor will be hard fought. Any Amrothian commander must juggle the economic needs of the nation with the pressing matter of southern defence. Alongside their capital of Dol Amroth, the nation-state holds power over the ruins of Itheland and Gobel Tofelas, along with the castle of Methrast and the river town of Linhir. They are surrounded on all land borders by their, arguably, greater overlords from Gondor. Gondor, however, must focus all its military might on the war in Mordor, and there will be few occasions where the armies of the Dunedain can fight together. Dol Amroth in Divide and Conquer are famed for their heavy-hitting and elite cavalry, but also for their well-drilled and regimented army. There are few weaknesses in the military roster, and once their economy can get up to speed, they can stand toe-to-toe against almost any enemy. Knights of the Silver Swan. Perhaps the Brotherhood of the Talon's crowning accomplishment was the outfitting and training of these heavily armed knights. The mounts of the company have been selectively bred and trained over many years, such that they no longer resemble the admittedly excellent Rohirric stock they were taken from. The men of Rohan may live and die in the saddle, but the Knights of the Silver Swan are unmatched in the charge. Only the riders of the elves could hope to counter these fearsome warriors. When the silver blur of their lances strikes across the field, the ground shakes, the skies brighten, and the shadow quakes. White Knights of Itheland. Whilst long abandoned by the elves, the city of Itheland held many treasures for the coming Amrothians. But in honour of their old allies, the prince only allowed men and women of elven blood to live in the city permanently. This union of human and elven has brought the city back to life, with aspects of both peoples reflected in the newly erected buildings. But this union is perhaps best seen in the arms and armour of the White Knights. In keeping with their elven tradition, the White Knights ride to war armed with bow, sword, and shield. And despite their heavy armour, they are lightning fast. Their skill at mounted archery is nearly unmatched save for the savages coming from the steppes of Khand. This song was sung by Legolas as the beleaguered members of the Fellowship camped by the Nimrodel River in Lothlorien. It is said the true song is longer and tells more of the fates of Lothlorien, but alas, Legolas could only remember the end. An elven maid there was of old, a shining star by day. Her mantle white was hemmed with gold, and her shoes of silver grey. A star was bound upon her brows, a light was on her hair, a sun upon the golden boughs in Lorien the fair. Her hair was long, her limbs were white, and fair she was, and free, and in the wind she went as light as the leaf of linden tree. Beside the falls of Nimrodel, by water clear and cool, her voice as falling silver fell into the shining pool. Where now she wanders, none can tell, in sunlight or in shade, for lost of yore was Nimrodel, and in the mountains strayed. The elven ship in haven grey, beneath the mountain lee, awaited her for many a day, beside the roaring sea. A wind by night in northern lands arose, and loud it cried, and drove the ship from elven strands across the streaming tide. When dawn came dim, the land was lost, the mountains sinking grey, beyond the heaving waves that tossed their plumes of blinding spray. Amroth beheld the fading shore, now low beyond the swell, and cursed the faithless ship that bore him far from Nimrodel. Of old he was an elven king, a lord of tree and glen, when golden were the boughs in spring in fair Lothlorien. From helm to sea they saw him leap, as arrow from the string, and dive into the water deep, as mew upon the wing. The wind was in his flowing hair, the foam about him shone. Afar they saw him strong and fair, go riding like a swan. But from the west has come no word, and on the hither shore no tidings elven folk have heard of Amroth evermore. And so concludes the Divide and Conquer faction overview for Dol Amroth. I do hope that you've enjoyed this episode. I thoroughly enjoyed this episode, I have to say. Very exciting to write and read up about Dol Amroth. It's always exciting to read about Dol Amroth. It's absolutely fascinating. I'm disappointed daily that Tolkien sadly gave up of life before he could expand on the peoples and the land of Dol Amroth. Everyone talks about Gondor and Minas Tirith, but it's in Dol Amroth that the pride of Gondor lives on. But anyway, for now, that is all. I do hope you've enjoyed. I hope you're enjoying this series. And until we speak again, dear friends, Navar Nadem Pedamad Melunin, and farewell.